In this recording, we're going to look at the new area of relevant costing. So just to recap what we've covered previously, we looked at the whole area of CVP analysis, cost, volume, profit analysis, and that was really looked at routine decision making. So the relationship between the volume you have, the costs that you have, and the profit that you make. And we say that's very important for certain industries such as airlines, hotels, and even farming. That practically they use the idea of load factor in airlines. They use the idea of break-even occupancy in hotels, and for example, the break-even beef price or the break-even milk price when you're talking about farming. And what we looked at there is the whole idea of cost behavior. How do costs behave when volume goes up or down? Is it a variable cost? Is it a fixed cost? Or is it a mixed cost? So it's just another way of looking at your cost base. Previously, we would have looked at direct cost versus indirect cost when we were trying to cost products or cost services. And today then we're moving on to a new way to look at costs for non-routine decisions. So this is kind of your one-off decisions, making a special order, closing down a plant, or deciding a particular job. And we're looking at what are the techniques that accounting can give us, and where maybe does that overlap with organizational behavior or even managerial psychology to say, well, do we make some fatal flaws in terms of how we analyze particular projects, and what other influences come over and above, I suppose, the economic or the financial. So we look at the techniques, we look at this idea of sensitivity analysis, and we'll also look at non-financial factors. But again, similar to the previous ones, I want you to get into more the mindset. There is a technical aspect to this, and we'll talk you through calculations. But there's also the whole idea of how to look at costs. When you're making a decision of whether to hire someone, whether to open that new store, whether to take on that new special order, what's the cost you include and what are the costs that you leave out? And is that the right way to look at things? So for relevant costing, we'll focus on a variety of different decision makings. For example, should you make or buy? Should you outsource something? Should you replace particular equipment? Should you look at alternative uses for facilities? And the point is what we're looking at here, as the name suggests, we're looking for the relevant costs. What's the relevant things we should consider? And what is also, I suppose, important as well, is what's irrelevant. And often you'll see is there's managerial biases, there's other non-financial or non-economic reasons that certain costs can be included and certain costs can't. So again, think of your own managerial role. You have to be able to justify, you have to be able to critique other people's analysis. Why did they put those costs in the price of the order? What way are you looking at the profit or loss statement on a store you're looking to close down or a factory you're looking to close down? Is that the right way to look at things? Because you have to get the confidence to be able to question figures and not just accept them at face value. Because remember, as we've talked about in class, the figures themselves, it can be as important who prepared them than what the figures actually say. So be able to manipulate and understand where figures can be manipulated is a very important skill set to have for a manager as well. So what are the key terms we're looking for is relevant costs are future costs. And that's the first thing is they must be in the future. Any cost that's incurred in the past is what we call a sunk cost. It's not going to change. And that can be a behavioral or psychological bias where managers look at the past in terms of what's been spent and don't look towards the future. So accountants say you should be looking at the future and it must change. i.e. the cost must differ between one choice and the other. If the cost doesn't differ, it's not a relevant cost. Because if it doesn't change, it's not going to be impacted by the decision. And it must be a cash flow. It can't be just an accounting entry such as depreciation or some other accounting adjustment. It must actually be a cash flow that's going to impact your cash balances. So we're looking there, it's future focused, it must change, and it must be a cash flow to be relevant. And often you'll see when you go back and think of the analysis that you've taken before, the way you look at things, you may be including certain things that are not relevant, or you may be excluding certain things that are relevant. Let's try and get around those biases, or if you come across them in other people, try and get them to justify why are certain things left in, or certain things left out. And the first thing we're going to be looking at is a common thing called a sunk cost. So this is a past cost that's already been incurred. You've already spent the money on your new product development. You've already spent the money on a new fleet of cars, but that's not going to change. So that money has already been spent and it's irrelevant for decision making going forward. Now that can be difficult because often managers are bedded into a particular project or there's political reputation attached with a certain spend. But from an economic and accounting perspective, we say those sunk costs are irrelevant. They're not going to change now. They've already been committed. So you should look at the best course of action from now on. Now, we know in politics and we know in a lot of business decisions that can be very difficult to do because there's a lot of, again, reputational capital built up in expenditure that's already happened. And to pull the plug now would damage a lot of reputations. Right? So, for example, if a company was deciding whether to make or buy a product, the decision of the factory rent will have to be paid in the short term, and that's a key point, is somewhat irrelevant. So what we're arguing, if that factory rent is going to be paid regardless, so if it's going to be cheaper for us, for comparing all other costs, to buy it versus make it, well then whatever saving we have will go towards paying those factory rent that would have already have to be paid anyway. So you're trying to look at, does the cost change depending on whether we make it or we buy it in? If it's cheaper to buy it in, looking at all the other costs, well then that difference will help you pay towards your rent, which it has to be paid anyway. Now, of course, in the long term, the factory rent, of course, is an important one. But in short-term decisions, where you're looking for one-off decisions, you have to make sure, will the cost change or not? If the cost is a past one that's already committed, it's not going to change regardless of what decision you make. It's irrelevant for decision making. Now, it's not to say that historical costs are not useful. Look, we use historical costs to estimate our break-even rate in CVP. We use historical costs to come up with activity-based costing and activity-based management inputs. But the point is how you look at it in terms of, is this an additional cost that's going to change, or has it already been committed? And if it's already been committed, we're looking for the best way forward to reduce those costs overall. So sometimes what happens is there's psychological bias or behavioural issues involved. So think back to your module now on organisational behaviour to say, well, if I spent €1 million on equipment last year and now they're looking to outsource production, I'm not going to be supporting that because it's going to look like I'm the one that has made a poor decision only 1 year ago, and my potential reputation, the embarrassment, the loss is going to be put on my responsibility. So you can have these behavioural biases or pet projects where you know it makes sense to move on, but because money has been committed and there's been people's reputations attached to that, some costs can be heavily included and considered when you're looking at whether to close a store, whether to delist particular new product development that has been done. And that can create a lot of conflict within an organisation. Right? And this is often called the sunk cost trap or the sunk cost fallacy. Sometimes it's also referred to as the Concorde fallacy. So if anyone remembers the Concorde project between, I think it was the British and French governments, so this high-speed aircraft. The problem was it was foreseen for a number of years that this was not economically viable. It was going down the Swanee. But the point was the government had put so much money into it previously, and there was so much political reputation and political capital attached to it that they kept throwing, as we said, throwing good money after bad. From an economic perspective, they said you should, regardless of what you spent before, cut the cord. Don't look in the past. Say, what does it look like from now to the future? Do the costs outweigh the benefits, regardless of what we spent in the past? And individuals commit this sunk cost or Concorde fallacy when they continue behaviour as a result of previously invested resources. Well, I've put in 2 years already, what's another year? What you should be looking for is, what return could that year get somewhere else, compared to where it might get me in this particular project. And the same with money invested. You might plough another 200 million into a pharma project because you have 400 million invested already, and you don't want to have to wipe that off and deal with the consequences at a board level. So think about it. Does it make sense to plough more money in on a justification that we've put so much money in already? Is that the right psychology to do? And sometimes it can be rational for particular people to do it because of reputational concerns or time constraints. And there's a nice little article if you want to read that on Loop online. It's not a mandatory article, but it's a good one to say, well, maybe economic perspective is too basic in terms of ignore sunk costs. Maybe there are reasons or times where sunk costs are important to influence decision making. But what I just want to get you to question is, think about decisions that have been made. Have you delisted products? Have you closed stores? Right? Have you outsourced call centers? And have you included the right costs? Or just because of certain money spent before, that has influenced the decisions. So instead, what accountants say and what we look at in financial is, you should be looking at the incremental costs. What that means, is it incremental over and above the current costs? So does it have an additional cost because a particular course of action was selected? So some costs are not incremental because they don't change. So you're only interested in what is the cash change because of decision. Is there extra money coming in, incremental benefits, or is there extra costs, incremental costs? So think about that knowledge is, what's the incremental benefits and the incremental costs? And that may give you a different perspective than someone putting in a load of costs that would not change. But it was trying to get you to get the confidence to say, question figures when they're presented to you in terms of financial analysis. What is the basis that they're made on? What has been left in and what has been left out? So for example here, this ABC company, they have a new order, special order of 1,000 units. Selling price is €5 each, and additional variable costs, so they're incremental, is €3 each. And the fixed costs for the year are 20,000. Now remember, we're looking at a short-term decision. So in the short term, the fixed costs don't change. So what we call those, they are sunk costs, they're already committed. So they're not going to change, they're irrelevant. Now in the longer term, of course they're relevant, because if you have too much fixed costs and you continue to price the project or price the units at €5 each, you're not going to make any profit. But if we're looking at a short-term basis, and this is the logic to look at, in the short term, we have to pay the 20,000 anyway. So if we can sell an extra 1,000 units and get an extra 2,000 in, that's going to contribute towards covering the costs that have already been committed. So it doesn't make sense to include fixed costs in your pricing of this particular order. Because if you did, you wouldn't accept it and you wouldn't earn 2,000 extra profit, incremental profit, to cover the 20,000 that's already committed. So remember, these irrelevant costs, they're already committed. They're going to have to be paid anyway, so they shouldn't be included. And any benefit you get above all the rest of the costs, well, that's going to help to pay for those. Now, that can be a tricky mindset for students to get into. But think about it. If we didn't accept this project, we still have to pay the 20 grand. And we don't have 2,000 extra euro to cover it. So we're worse off if we don't accept this special order. Now, I know I'm only looking at it from a financial perspective. You might argue, well, maybe there's a marketing perspective. Is this lower than the price you offer to other customers, etc.? And we will talk about that in terms of non-financial considerations. But from a financial perspective, we are looking solely at, does this make sense financially? And in this case, it does, because it's going to give us 2,000 euro extra profit to help us cover the costs we've already committed to, which is the 20,000 fixed costs. And we're looking at this in the short term. The longer term, everything is relevant and everything can change. So that's the dynamic that you have to be careful of, or the perspective when you're making the time frame of the decision. Now, so if some costs are something that usually are put in and they shouldn't be, opportunity costs are the opposite. These are costs that are relevant and should be in there, but they're rarely considered. An opportunity cost is the cost of foregoing alternative uses. Because you go with one alternative rather than the other, you have the cost of a lost opportunity. Right? So for example, if I decide to spend 100 million euro on a new pharma development, so new development of a drug, that means that 100 million euro can't be used to restructure my IT system, where there's cost savings involved, or it can't be used to expand operations overseas. And maybe I'm losing out on profitable opportunities there. So you're trying to look at what is the best alternative course of action and what money am I foregoing? Because every spend, every decision you do, you're coming with choices. And the one you choose must be better than the alternatives. But often what happens is the alternatives aren't quantified. And therefore you're not considering what the opportunity cost is. And why they're usually not put in is, it's not an explicit cost. So it's not that you're actually spending money on an opportunity cost, but it is relevant because it's money foregone because you went with one choice over the other. So for example here, if the grape company is considering whether to accept a new order or not, but the factory is currently at full capacity, if they do accept a new order, right, another order won't be filled. So if you're at full capacity, you're going to have to cancel one order with an existing customer to fill the new order. So any money that's lost on the cancelled order, that's what we call an opportunity cost. So when you're doing your analysis, that's an implied cost that has to be covered. Because if it doesn't cover the €1,000, then it's not a better alternative. So you have to be able to quantify and think, if I'm giving up some capacity in the factory, it has to be more profitable than what I'm giving up. So it's quite a straightforward one. But the point is, it can be a very powerful one. And we'll see this. I'll give you examples in marketing. I'll give you examples in the public sector. And I'll give you examples in politics where opportunity costs can be very effective in terms of convincing people to a particular choice or path. And sometimes you need to make sure, have we included these opportunity costs in our analysis? What could we have done with that €100 million would have been more effective? Right? If we do close this store and we lose all our profitability, what are we doing with the money that's going to be more profitable? So this thing of an opportunity cost is quite powerful, and we'll see it in a lot of practical examples in a second. Right? So we can see here, particularly in the media, it's been used a lot of the time. So if you remember 2 or 3 years ago, there's a big important tax case where it said that Apple owed us about 13 or 14 billion euro. And then, of course, the Irish government wanted to appeal that because they didn't agree with the decision, because it would damage the position for multinationals. But then the media outlets would have said, what could we have done with 13 billion? So we're saying that's the opportunity cost by appealing. We're losing out on this many hospitals, this many roads, this many motorways. So they're trying to quantify it in understandable terms. What are we losing? What is the opportunity cost by appealing this? And similarly, we'll see in a second, the pro-Brexit campaigners use that, trying to very effectively to figure out what's the opportunity cost of staying in the EU in terms of the money that's lost by the EU membership. Now, whether it was correct or not is another thing, but it can be effectively used in marketing campaigns. You'll often hear, oh, why don't you sign up for our streaming service or our Netflix service for the price of a coffee a week? That's using opportunity costs to make it a trivial spend, to show you that it's not expensive, it's not a big opportunity cost. So there's effective ways, even in marketing, of using accounting concepts to get the message across. And it's a bit more understandable to the layperson as well. What am I giving up by doing this particular activity or purchase? So I've given you one on Scoop It, and a Harvard Business Review article, The Persuasive Power of Opportunity Cost. That's from a marketing perspective. And there's also a longer academic paper on the same area. Now, again, it's not vital reading. We're just trying to show you, look, accounting is one piece of the jigsaw. Remember those? That's a single window, but it can be used in other perspectives. In terms of, we talked about before, segmenting the market in terms of activity-based management and customer profitability analysis. But also when you look at the idea of getting across to customers the idea of opportunity costs of when you spend money with me, what will you save or what will you lose if you don't go with me? So it's a very useful example. And we'll take a look at some real world examples now to see where do we see this idea of different costs and when they're included and when they're not, and there's a debate about them, and the use of opportunity costs in the real world as well. So if we look at here, I took a couple of examples. They're quite recent that we're looking at. One of the first ones is looking at the whole idea of Irish Water. So again, the big debate was when it was set up, they wanted to close it down, abolish it. But you even look at the headlines here. It would cost 900 million to abolish Irish Water. Some would say it cost 7 billion. One is saying it cost 1.6 billion. And I guarantee you'll have come across some of these in your roles as well. Different people debate how much it's going to cost to close the store. How much are we going to lose if we delist that product? How much are we going to lose if we reorganize things, we spend that money on a restructuring? And remember, it's as important to understand who has prepared the numbers than what the numbers actually say. So I have up on Scoop It a nice RTE article done by Sean Whelan, which looked at where are the numbers coming from, what's included, what isn't, and this is getting back to relevant costing. So if we look at here, he's done up a little one. It's somewhere between 5.5 and 6.7 billion euro, but there's different things made up. The actual cost of shutting down Irish Water was only 100 million. Now, only, I say, which is quite frivolous, but what we're saying here compared to the other costs, the shutdown cost is quite small. So that's the actual out of pocket. But what we're saying then is there's two opportunity costs here. You're losing 1.6 billion of revenue. That would have been generated from the public. That's an opportunity cost because we're deciding to close it. We're going to lose this revenue. So it's an opportunity foregone. And likewise, there's another roughly 1.6 billion, which is the lost efficiency gain. By bringing all those local authority water groups together, you lose the economies of scale that you would have had. So they're not explicit costs, but the point is they're slotted in. And the last one was even a more indirect cost, but it's still a relevant one because it's an impact of Irish Water. That if Irish Water was shut down, that would mean the debt of Irish Water comes back on the government debt, which restricts their borrowing for the future, and that means they're going to have higher interest rate costs, etc. Now, that was a more niche one, but again, it's probably one of the bigger ones in the overall scheme of things. So what we wanted to show you is, even for a simple thing like Irish Water, in terms of how much is it going to cost to close it, you can have varying different perspectives. Some people include the lost revenue. Some people will just look at the out-of-pocket expense, i.e. the closure of redundancies, dealing with the IT system, etc. But it's important that you understand what numbers are in and what numbers aren't. Because if you don't, you may come to the wrong conclusion about closing a store, about taking on a project or not. And that is important because we want to give you the confidence to say what's in the numbers. What basis are those numbers prepared? Who prepared them? And if we change the numbers, would we come to a different decision? So that's a very practical one, looking at Irish Water and which numbers are taken for which agenda. The other very good one from a couple of years ago was looking at the whole idea of the e-voting machines. So this rambled on for a number of years where Fianna Fáil would have brought them in, they didn't want to get rid of them. So it took until Fine Gael came in, and Minister Phil Hogan said he got rid of them for €9 each. Now, of course, generally, the reason Fianna Fáil didn't want to get rid of them was, economically they weren't worthwhile, but there was such a political capital built up in that spend, they didn't want to recognise that loss because it would attach to them. And when you look when Fine Gael got in and did it, they said, poorly delivered by my political predecessors and cost the taxpayer 55 million. And you'll often see that when new managers come in, they will start getting rid of old projects, getting rid of pet projects, taking those losses straight away because they can attach responsibility to someone else. Because generally, if the manager is there and has made those decisions before, they may be reluctant to delist a product. They may be reluctant to cut the cord on an R&D project because their reputation is attached to it. And it takes a new manager to come in. And that phrase is often called taking a bath, where you put a load of the losses in, take all your hits straight away when you're a new manager, because you can attach responsibility to the old regime that was there. And that gets back to the whole bias around not wanting or considering some costs when you shouldn't. And it takes a new manager to come in who's not attached to those sunk costs to pull the cord. That's another example of a very practical one we've seen in the last couple of years. The last two then I've looked at is the example of using opportunity costs for a particular agenda. So the Brexiteers vote leave, this famous bus which says if we send 350 million a week, and it said if you choose us, you're going to get that benefit in. So if you stay in the EU, you're going to have an opportunity cost of €350 million a week, and we can fund that to the National Health Service. Now, of course, it turned out a lot of that may have been hot air, but the point is it's quite effective to a lot of the population. They can understand, and not the 350 million, but the point is we could use that to spend it somewhere else. So we're getting an idea and giving the people an idea, what impact does this decision have financially? And another one, the likes of the discounters, your Aldis and your Lidls, they have very good campaigns looking at if you save, or if you switch over to shopping at Aldi in this case, you can save €337 over 4 weeks. So what they're trying to do indirectly is to say that's your opportunity cost by staying with your Dunnes, your Tesco, your SuperValu. You're losing out on that kind of savings. So it's a very effective one of marketing and getting people to kind of quantify in their head, not just come to Aldi, we've great prices. It's actually putting figures on it, letting people figure out the impact certain decisions have. And it's quite an effective technique. IKEA would use it, and a lot of people would use it where you're trying to quantify the value you have because you're lower cost. Right? But you can also do it for other services like streaming services I mentioned, where you'll say for the price of a coffee a week, you can get access to your online newspaper. So you can do it in terms of big figures to signify the size, the opportunity cost, or you can try and justify and say, look, this is a very small opportunity cost by coming in to sign up for our service. So the overlap between opportunity cost and marketing is quite significant as well. So it's a good idea to look at your module of marketing and think, could we see any of that opportunity cost in some marketing campaigns and how it's effectively used? Okay, so if we go back here, we're going to look at one example then just to illustrate what's the key decisions you might be looking at in terms of a numerical example. So have a read through this and we want you to answer the first part. So try and pause it and read through and think, well, what's my answer going to be here now? We're asking, what's the minimum price at which the garage should sell the car with a reconditioned engine fitted? The minimum price. It's not to say they want to sell it, but what's the bare minimum they look for? So pause it a second and see can you do some numbers out and try and work through your logic as to, am I happy with that as a minimum price? Does that make sense? So if we're looking at it here, the key thing, your starting point is, well, what's the minimum price if we sell a reconditioned car with a reconditioned engine fitted? Well, your starting price should be here. Your starting price is the opportunity cost, which is the 3.5. Right? Because that's how much you could sell the bare car for currently at. So your starting point shouldn't be the historical cost. Right? Doesn't make sense to start that as the basis because you could currently sell it without the reconditioned engine at 3.5. So if I do recondition the engine, I definitely need to get 3.5 for it. And I also need to get 300 because I have to buy that engine. So the engine itself is going to cost 300. Now, the last piece is the tricky one, that you shouldn't really include the labor cost here, which is 7 hours at €15. So 7 times 15, which is €105. And the reason you don't do that is it's short of work, but the owners are reluctant to lay off workers. What we're saying is this €105 was going to be spent anyway. Right? Now, of course, in a perfect world, you'd want to get that covered as well, but we've asked you for the minimum price. So we're saying anything above 3,800 would make financial sense. Right? So think about that now. Because if you said, for example, 3,300, what you've missed out on the fact is you can sell it for 3.5 grand currently. So why would you accept any price lower than 3.5 grand? Because you can do that without doing anything. So your historic cost of 3,000 is actually a sunk cost. What we're looking at is what would we forgo now if we don't sell it? We're going to forgo 3.5. So that has to be our starting point. Now, where students would have went wrong, for example, if they included the 105. Think, for example, if I got offered 3,850 of an offer. So you got offered 3,850 for the reconditioned engine. If you said included the 105, your minimum price would be 3,905. So you would have rejected the offer. However, think about it. This labour is going to be paid anyway. So if you leave out the labour, you were saying that's going to be €50 over your minimum price. And because the labour is going to be paid anyway, that will give me €50 to contribute towards paying the labour. So that is why we leave out costs that don't change. Here, think about it. If you had said 3,905 is the minimum, you would have rejected the offer. And in that case, you still have to pay the full 105. You have nothing to support it. Right? But if we had taken the offer with a €50 extra to still cover some of the labour cost. So that's what you're trying to look at is what is the incremental cost and the incremental benefits. This does not change because they had idle hours and they're going to be paid anyway, so they may as well be doing something. It's not to say you'll be happy taking the minimum, but the point is here, anything above that minimum will be financially worthwhile and help you to cover those costs that don't change. That is a tricky one. How does it change then if you're now at full capacity and the labour charge per hour is €60? So think of it here. If we're in scenario 2 now, you are going to put in a labour cost. But the trick is, should I put in the labour cost at how much I pay them or how much I charge out at? And the answer here should be, you're going to put it in at labour is going to be 7 times 60. Why? Because if they give up 7 hours to do this job, they're giving up €60 every hour of revenue. So you need to make sure this project gets it back as well, which is 420. So the minimum price there would be 4,220. So we're just trying to get you to think in your head, what is the opportunity cost here? if they're not going to be working anyway and they've idle time, really anything that covers some of that cost will be beneficial. So it's an irrelevant cost. However, if they don't have any idle time and they have no spare capacity, that means I'm going to have an opportunity cost. I'm giving up chargeable hours to take on this project. So if it doesn't give me the same chargeable rate, it's not worthwhile and I shouldn't give it up. So your minimum price there to be as worthwhile would be 4220. And so make sure you go back over that and just make sure you understand. If not, don't be afraid to ask me and to work your way through it. But it can be tricky. Some people can take different perspectives, but the point is be able to talk through and justify why you're leaving certain costs out and why you're putting certain costs in. Because again, that's the whole basis of meetings, etc., is to be able to debate what's a relevant cost and what is an irrelevant cost. And once you are happy with that, then I want you to pause this and go on to the other video, which is on your loop page, called Jamco, and attempt part A of Jamco, which is looking what's the relevant costs and what are the irrelevant costs. Right, so once you've done your Jamco part A, we're looking at the other aspect to look at in these decisions is the whole idea of sensitivity analysis. Because remember, when you're making a lot of these financial decisions, you're really going to be making them based on estimates or forecasts. And not every input, the sales price, the material cost, etc., they're not going to be known with certainty. So what is often done is we look at how sensitive is the outcome to particular variables. Now again, we would have looked at last week in terms of margin of safety in CVP. Margin of safety is sensitivity analysis on the volume. By how much can the volume fall by before the company is break even. Right? So what we're looking at here is we're looking at individual variables and we're saying how sensitive is our result to the sales price, the material cost, the labor cost. Now you can do that with a pen and paper. Oftentimes you'll use an Excel as well. You can use functions like graphs, functions, data tables, and also the goal seek function, which we use in the Angelina screencast that's available on Loop. So again, you're not going to be examining any of that, don't worry. But it's important to have an appreciation. If you're a Ryanair, you're going to look at how sensitive is your profits to the price of fuel. Right? If you're a chocolate manufacturer, which we had 1 or 2 years ago, you're going to look at how sensitive is your profits to the price of cocoa beans. Right? It could be the price of cement, it could be the price of inputs such as fuel. So again, you want to look at sensitivity in terms of your bigger costs and how sensitive, how much is there a buffer or a margin of safety between your current position and the break-even position. Right? So, for example, what is the break-even price in the contract? By how much can the raw materials price move before the contract is loss-making? Or how sensitive is your deal or your contract to the foreign exchange rate? Particularly important in terms of Brexit, how volatile the euro-sterling rate can be. Right? So sensitivity analysis typically looks at a single variable at a time. Some of you might have engaged in scenario analysis where you look at a bad scenario, a good scenario, optimistic and pessimistic, and a kind of a normal run rate scenario. Scenario analysis when you change a number of variables at the same time. So change the price, same as the labour, and same as the raw materials all at the same time. But it's quite an important one that you have an idea of what sensitivity analysis is about, and you can do basic calculations. And you'll see those in your Jamco, which is in part B and C, and also in the other questions in the pack. Right? And maybe have a think about it in your own company. Do you have key variables that you look at in terms of your business unit, and do you look at how sensitive they are? So is exchange rate a key variable because you import or you export particular products? Right? Is the price of labour, maybe it's the minimum wage, is that a key price or key sensitivity that you look at on a constant basis? Could be the price of raw materials. Right? So you could be getting raw material, cocoa beans, it could be wheat or grain if you're a cereal producer. And how do you manage that? Do you have a risk management strategy in place, or do you just kind of take it as the market swings happen? And so it's a way to looking at how we this analysis, particularly for younger companies, that takes a bit more time to get more formal analysis, whereas the more mature businesses will have a bit more of a formal risk management policy in place in terms of how they manage those key variables. So when you are doing your financials, of course, remember back to our week 1, it's only one window. And often in some of these questions, I will get you to think about, well, financially, is it worthwhile to close the store or not, or take on the new contract? But I'll also ask you non-financial. So you're looking at, will this have an impact on our customers? Will there be a longer term impact on this decision? So this is where you put your managerial hat on and you try and give points that won't be captured by the financial analysis. So for example, if you're outsourcing or may result in closure of division, then you're looking at the impact on employee morale, the impact in terms of, well, is the outsourced company the same quality? Do you have the same guaranteed lead times? So we're just trying to think, can you present a business case? One element of the business case is the financial side of things, but I want you to get thinking outside the box then for companies such as Kumo and Angelina. What are the non-financial things? And there'll always be non-financial requirements. Because remember, numbers will only tell you one thing. You have to look at the marketing side of things, the HR side of things, the strategic side of things to make a full and comprehensive decision. So go back and have a look at JAM Corp Part B and C when you get a chance. And then go on and look at the other questions in the pack, the Kumo, the Angelina, which will give you more practice on those. Right? And again, if you are in trouble, don't be afraid to ask me an email, because I know this is an online session, but we have some of those companies' questions online to help you as a walkthrough as well. Right? So our key takeaways from this lecture then is that we're looking here at short-term, non-routine decisions. So closing a store, special order product, outsourcing a product. And we're trying to figure out is, how will managers filter all the relevant information? What is a relevant cost? What is irrelevant? And two particular ones we looked at were sunk costs, which are often included and they shouldn't, and opportunity costs, which are often excluded when they shouldn't. So go back and have a look at those. We showed you a couple of practical examples in terms of Irish Water, in terms of how the Brexiteers used it, and also how Aldi and other discounters are using it for marketing campaigns as well. So it's quite an important concept to grasp, and hopefully it'll give you a bit more confidence to question figures and analysis that will be put in front of you in your role. Right? And then we look briefly at sensitivity analysis and your non-financial factors, which you will, as part of many questions, use just to double check your analysis. How sensitive is it to particular variables, or to add more business case towards it by looking at the non-financial aspects of a decision. So go back now and have a look at your question pack, finish those questions. I have given you 3 readings. So they're longer academic readings. They're not mandatory, but if you want to have a read them because you're interested in it, by all means, they're all available on Loop. And I'll have 2 articles on Scoop It on the Irish Water example and on opportunity costs from Harvard Business Review. So they might be an interesting read if you're interested on those particular aspects. So that was the online lecture looking at relevant costing. So what's a relevant and what's an irrelevant cost.